Well, we now move into the 4th century, the 300s, and what I want to do in this lecture is spend most of the time talking about the rise of Constantine, who was an emperor. He's extremely important to early Christianity because he's the first Christian emperor that we have. Now, I had mentioned in the last lecture about the great persecution by Emperor Diocletian. So Diocletian set up the Tetrarchy, and if you remember, that was where you've got the emperor at the top, and then just below him, you've got sort of a vice president called a Caesar. And Diocletian was one of the rare emperors that decided to retire in 305, and he let the Tetrarchy take over. Now, in 306, you've got Constantius, and I had mentioned him in the last lecture. He was the father of Constantine. So in the Tetrarchy, Constantine was not a Caesar for Constantius. So Diocletian tried to keep those two separate. He tried to keep the son Constantine away from his father Constantius. But eventually Constantine talked Diocletian into letting him go to England, which is where Constantius was. Now, Constantine went to Constantius, and the two ended up fighting with some of the barbarian groups that were in Great Britain during this time, or Britain. And what happened is Constantius died. Now, what should have happened is the Caesar Severus should have become emperor, because that's the way the Tetrarchy worked. But the troops really liked Constantine, and what they ended up doing is declaring him emperor. So what you end up having are two emperors in the western part of the Roman Empire. Now these are a few images of a statue, and these are the only parts that that we still have. You can see the head on your left, a large foot, and then the hand. And what the hand is probably doing is pointing up to heaven. We think it probably stood about 35 feet tall. So you've got Severus, who wants to be the emperor. You've got Constantine, who is declared emperor. You also have Maxentius, who was a son of Maximian. He wanted to become emperor as well. So you've got three people all wanting to become emperor. Severus died in battle. And then you've got Maxentius and Constantine going to do battle over who is going to be the sole emperor of the West. So according to a story, and we get a couple versions of this, Constantine looked up, saw in the sky a vision of the cross, and he heard the voice of Jesus saying, with this sign you will conquer. And the sign that we're talking about here, that I'm talking about here, is this called the chi, which is like an X, and this, which looks like a P, but is a rho, an R. So forget these symbols, the alpha and omega. Right now we're just talking about this symbol, which is called chi rho. And so he put this symbol on the standards of the flags of his troops and went to battle, thinking that if he did win, he would owe his allegiance to this Christian god. This battle happened at the Milvian Bridge, which is in Italy, in Rome, and it was Constantine versus Maxentius. Now, as you might imagine, Constantine won this particular battle. Maxentius ended up drowning, as far as we know, in the Tiber River. Now, you've got Constantine as the sole emperor in the West, but you still have an emperor in the East, and that is Galerius. And if you remember from the last lecture on the Great Persecution, it was Diocletian and Galerius who were causing the persecution. Galerius stops this in 311. He cancels the Great Persecution, and part of the reason for this, at least according to a person named Lactantius, he wrote a book called On the Death of the Persecutors, and in section 33, what he says is Galerius was brought down by probably cancer. And what he ends up doing is he asks the Christian God for help, even though he'd been persecuting for quite a while. So what he ended up doing is canceling the Great Persecution. Now what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and then read through this particular section. And then on this slide, you've got on the deaths of the persecutors, chapter 34. And so what he does is he bestows clemency on the Christians. So they can now assemble, they can now openly pray to their God. But what he wants, though, is for the Christian God to pray for his own welfare. That's the royal hour. And pray for the public, and pray for their own safety. So he cancels the Great Persecution mostly because he wants the Christian God to help him get over whatever illness it was. But he ended up dying. And you have a man named Licinius who becomes the emperor in the East. And I'll talk about Licinius in just a bit. What you're looking at here is a photo that I took in Rome, and this is the Arch of Constantine. And where I'm taking the photo is I'm standing with my back to the Roman Colosseum. So you come to the Forum, and you can see a little bit of the Forum back here, and you wrap around. Most people end up going to the Colosseum, not even realizing what they're looking at here with this triumphal arch, which is made for Constantine. This was made after he was made emperor. Here's just another version of it from the other side. Okay, so Constantine, he's got a really interesting history. We're not sure when he became Christian. So it's believed that he sort of had his conversion during this big battle with Maxentius, but we're not quite sure because he does issue coins after he becomes emperor. And as you can see from these two coins, this is actually one side, and then they flipped the coin over. You've got Constantine here, and you've got him portrayed as Apollo here. And then on the second coin, it's the same thing. This is the front side, this is the back side. You can see here that Constantine is portrayed as Apollo, or this is actually an image of Apollo. So you wouldn't expect a Christian emperor to mint coins that are really glorifying the Roman deities, but Constantine certainly did. Now later on, you've got this particular coin. This is an image of Constantine, and on the back side, you've got this hand coming down, and most people believe this is the hand of the Christian God coming down, and you can see Constantine here, and he's lifting his hand up to reach God. So at some point, he becomes more serious in terms of being a Christian. Now we know in 313 he met with Emperor Licinius of the East, and both of them really put an end to the Great Persecution. And we think that they issued something called the Edict of Milan, and this is in 313. If you want to stop the video, you can certainly read this small bit of it. It's a slightly longer text than this, but essentially what it does is it gives Christians and others the right to worship openly. So this is really the first time that Christianity was able to be an open religion in the Roman Empire. Now, Licinius and Constantine really didn't like each other. They fought early on in between 313 and 325, and it was really a stalemate. Again, in 325, they come together to fight, and Constantine defeated Licinius. And what that means is Constantine becomes the sole emperor of both the East and the West. So the tetrarchy that started with Diocletian was totally done. Constantine had 3 sons. He actually had 4. He ended up killing one, but the 3 for our purposes are Constantius II, Constantine II, and Constans. So really easy to remember. They always remind me of George Foreman naming all of his sons George. So here you've got Constantius, Constantine, and Constans, who are the sons of Constantine. One thing I want to spend the rest of this lecture on talking about these 4 measures that Constantine put into place to really promote Christianity, and make sure that you know and understand these for your exam. So, and I'll briefly mention them here, and then I'll talk about the specifics. So he created a massive building program for Christian churches. What he ended up doing is giving tax relief to churches and bishops, and this is very similar to what we do today. I don't know if you know this, but religious buildings and those who run them are not taxed. He essentially elevated the priest and the bishop in equal terms with civil law. He also enacted policies against pagans or heretics, and I'll show you a few of that. There should be 5 here, but it's 4 plus the fact that he created a brand new city called Constantinople. And you can see here, obviously is named. He named it after himself. This O-P-L-E comes from a Greek word polis. I know that looks terrible writing here, but that means city, like metropolis, the mother city. Constantinople is the city of Constantine. He built that as a Christian city. Okay, in terms of building churches, so he built many churches throughout Italy, and his mother Helena also went to the Holy Land and built more churches. This is one example called St. John Lateran. Now, what you're looking at is not the church that Constantine built. So in the 1500s, the Catholic Church and one of the popes, or a few of the popes, ended up tearing down a lot of the old churches that were built by Constantine and then built these modern ones. But beneath the foundations are Constantinian. This is another very famous church. This is St. Peter's Basilica, as it looked like during the time of Constantine. So here you've got some archaeology of the original shape of the church, what it probably looked like. And just before it was torn down, some monks went in and drew what it looked like. So that's pretty nice, because the modern church today does not look like what it did before. And again, if you ever go to Rome, what you can do is take an archaeological tour under the modern St. Peter's to see some of these, the remains of the old church. Another church he had built was St. Sebastian, and this is in Rome. There's a very famous catacomb under this church. And again, the front of this church was not built by Constantine. It was torn down in the 1500s and then rebuilt. But again, if you go through the tour, you can look at the archaeology from the time of Constantine. Okay, so in terms of his tax relief, what I've given you here, and you should probably stop the video to look through these because I won't be going through all of them, is that you've got a set of laws called the Theodosian Codes. These were put together by an emperor named Theodosius II, who ruled from 408 to 450. And what he did was he ordered that all of the Roman law be put together in a book. And at that time, it hadn't been done before. You also have something called the Sermonian constitutions. These are longer versions or uncondensed versions of the Theodosian Code. So if you look up either one of these, you'll get the same information. The Theodosian Codes are just a little shorter. So in 313, he made all priests exempt from compulsory public services. Now, usually what happened is that wealthy people would be put on city councils automatically, and they would help run their own cities. So he took the priests out of that. In 321, the law changed that when people die, they can leave their estate to the church and not the state of Rome. So what this ends up doing is putting a lot of wealth into the Catholic Church, while at the same time taking wealth away from the Roman Empire. And then you can look at a few of these other things. In 330, the lower parts of the hierarchy were not allowed to sit on the municipal councils. And then in 343, under his son Constantius II, this is after the death of Constantine, clergy didn't have to pay taxes. Any businesses they started, those were also tax-free. In terms of elevating the bishop to civil law, this started a little bit earlier than what I have here, but on May 5th, 333, we've got a law that said the legal decisions of the bishops are unchangeable. Now, what this means is, say you're a pagan and you're having some difficulties with your Christian neighbor, say over a boundary. You could go into the civil law courts, and anytime just before the civil law judge made his decree, the Christian could raise his hand and stop the court proceedings, and those would then be moved into the Christian bishop. And so it'd be taken out of civil law, put into a Christian church or a Christian bishop, and the bishop would act as the judge, and his judgment could not be changed. So that's what I mean by the elevation of the bishop or priest in terms of civil law. Another thing that I didn't put in terms of the four things that ended up changing, but you do see this, what I've called the Christianization of the empire over time. So in 321, Sundays were declared days of rest for most people, not farmers. And if you want to look this up, you can. It's Justinian Code 3.12.3. And then in 321, the same year, you've got a law that said courts cannot meet on Sundays unless they're freeing slaves. And this is Theodosian Code 2.8.1. Okay, in terms of anti-pagan policies, there's quite a bit of debate in the scholarship about whether Constantine actually did some of these things. But if you, why don't you stop the video and then read through some of this. And what you'll be reading is part of Eusebius of Caesarea's Life of Constantine. And if you look this up, it's chapter 3, section 54. And what you're reading here is Eusebius says that Constantine made a law that allowed Christians to go in and essentially strip a pagan temple. So they could take everything out of the temple, everything that was movable, all the wealth, and take it out, and Christians would not get in trouble for this. And then again, hopefully you've read through this so you understand what exactly is going on in terms of what Eusebius is saying during the time of Constantine. What's really interesting, though, is Constantine, sort of just like what I told you about with his conversion to Christianity, we're not quite sure when that happened. In 320, what he said is that if any public building got struck by lightning, these people called soothsayers or fortune tellers should be consulted and let them figure out what happened and why a public building would be hit by lightning, because that was a really bad sign. This is found in Theodosian Code 16.10.1. However, what you do find is that probably Constantine, and certainly his son, Constantius II, made a law that said pagan priests could not sacrifice. And the sacrifice of the killing of animals and blood and looking at the organs for fortune telling, this is a big part of pagan religion or Roman religion, and that was stopped by these people. And of course, as I mentioned, the last thing he ends up doing is building Constantinople. So you've got Rome here. Now, Rome, by the time of Constantine, was not as important as it was before. And certainly as you go along into the later 300s and early 400s, Rome just becomes sort of a figurehead for the Roman Empire. Constantine ends up building Constantinople right on this tip of Europe. And it was a great place to build a city because it could be protected. It's got water on 3 sides. And Constantine ended up building a wall on the 4th. And then later emperors built larger and larger walls to protect the city. But this was a city designed to be Christian, where Constantine could go. He set up a Roman Senate made up of Christians. And later, when you read texts written by people living in Constantinople, they call themselves Romans. So you have to be a little careful about reading these later texts, because they could say they're Romans even though they're not from the city of Rome.